At the base of Dowa Yalanne, the great sandstone mesa that rises above the Zuni River Valley in what is now western New Mexico, two stone columns stand apart from the surrounding cliff. They are weathered, narrow, and unmistakably separate from the rock formations around them, positioned at the exact edge where the valley floor meets the escarpment. The Zuni have a name for them, and a history attached to that name, one that has nothing to do with wind or erosion. According to Zuni tradition, these are not natural formations at all. They are a son and a daughter, turned to stone at the edge of a rising flood so that the water would stop climbing toward the people gathered on the mesa above. The story of how they came to stand there was already old when Frank Hamilton Cushing arrived at Zuni Pueblo in 1879, sent west by the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology to catalogue what its director, John Wesley Powell, understood as a vanishing category of human knowledge. Cushing stayed far longer than his assignment required. He was initiated into the priesthood of the bow, given a Zuni name, and entrusted, over years rather than weeks, with an account of a flood that predated any settler's arrival in the valley. What he recorded, and what the Bureau eventually did with what he recorded, are two different stories. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The account Cushing carried back east did not begin with the flood. It began much earlier, with an origin narrative the Zuni call the Chimiky'ana'kowa, the story of the beginning. In it, the ancestors of the Zuni did not arrive in the southwest from anywhere else. They emerged from within the earth itself, passing upward through 4 successive underworlds before reaching the surface of this one. The journey was neither quick nor complete on arrival. According to the tradition, the earliest humans who reached the surface world were unfinished in some sense, their bodies not yet suited to sunlight, their senses still adjusting to a sky instead of a ceiling of stone. Webbed fingers, tails, and eyes unaccustomed to daylight were said to have marked the first generation, features that were shed gradually as the people moved further from the place of emergence. They were guided by 2 beings, sons of the sun, remembered as the twin war gods Ahayuta and Matsailema, who led the people on a migration that lasted for generations before ending at a specific place, the place the Zuni call Itiwana, the middle place. That place is Halona, the site of old Zuni Pueblo on the banks of the Zuni River, and the mesa of Dowa Yalanne stands above it. The migration itself was long, broken into stages, with clans splitting off and rejoining at points still named within the tradition, some identified today with real geographic features scattered across Arizona and New Mexico. The narrative describes a system of ceremonial verification, a set of tests entrusted only to the ranking priests, by which a given valley could be confirmed or rejected as the true center of the world before the people committed themselves to settling it. This part of the tradition treats settlement as a technical achievement rather than an accident of geography, and it does not soften the cost of getting it wrong. Several earlier stopping points are remembered by name, each one abandoned only after the priests determined, through methods the tradition does not fully disclose to outsiders, that the place fell short of what was required. When the Zuni finally arrived at Halona, they had already rejected several such locations. The world they settled into was not empty, and it was not without hazard. It had a river, a fertile valley floor cut by centuries of seasonal runoff, and, before long, a catastrophe remembered with a specificity that an outside observer in 1880 might easily have filed away as ordinary folklore. By the time the flood is said to have occurred, the world the tradition describes at Halona was already a functioning one, not a scattering of survivors waiting for disaster. The valley supported irrigated fields of corn, beans, and squash along the river terraces, a farming system that later bureau surveyors would themselves document as sophisticated, built around waffle gardens and check dams designed to hold scarce rainfall in a landscape that received it unpredictably. Turquoise mined from deposits north of the valley moved outward through exchange networks that reached toward the Gulf of California in one direction and the Rio Grande Pueblos in the other, traded for shell, for macaw feathers carried up from what is now northern Mexico, and for obsidian worked into tools and ceremonial objects. None of this required a written record to function. The calendar that governed planting, harvest, and ceremony was maintained through observation of the sun's position against fixed landmarks on the horizon, a system precise enough to coordinate a farming community across an entire agricultural year without a single page of paper. The flood, in other words, did not strike an isolated or precarious settlement. It struck a village with an established relationship to its river, which is part of why the tradition remembers the crisis as one requiring the most serious response the priesthood could offer. The flood came, in the version Cushing recorded, after the people had settled at Halona and begun building their permanent village along the river. Heavy rains fell for an extended stretch, and the Zuni River, ordinarily a modest stream cutting through a wide, shallow valley, rose beyond anything the people had prepared for. Water began climbing toward the village itself, and the priests determined that an offering was required, not a symbolic one, but a direct and irreversible one. A young man and a young woman, identified in some versions of the account as the son and daughter of a chief priest, were dressed in their finest ceremonial clothing, adorned with turquoise and woven cotton, and led to the edge of the rising water. They were given to the flood. As the account describes it, the waters receded almost immediately afterward, and where the two had stood, 2 columns of stone remained, facing outward toward the mesa, permanently positioned at the edge of what had been the flood line. The people who survived the flood retreated to the top of Dowa Yalanne itself, a mesa rising more than 300 feet above the valley floor, its summit broad enough to support a settlement, and its approach narrow enough to be defended. What makes this account difficult to dismiss as simple invention is the specificity of its geography, and the fact that the geography still exists in a form that can be independently checked against other, unrelated historical records. Dowa Yalanne is a real mesa, still standing above the Zuni River, and it was used again, centuries after the flood the tradition describes, for exactly the purpose the tradition assigns to it. In 1680, during the Pueblo Revolt against Spanish colonial rule, the Zuni people abandoned their riverside villages and moved onto the top of Dowa Yalanne, where they lived for approximately 12 years before returning to the valley floor. This is not oral tradition alone. It is documented in Spanish colonial correspondence, in the accounts of the reconquest expeditions of the 1690s, and in the archaeological remains still visible on the mesa top today. Low stone foundations laid out in a pattern consistent with a settlement built quickly, under pressure, for defense rather than comfort. The mesa's role as a place of retreat from catastrophe is attested twice, once in a tradition describing a flood with no fixed date, and once in a documented historical episode separated from that tradition by an unknown span of centuries, and yet pointing to the same physical refuge. The 2 stone columns at the base of the mesa are also real, and their presence has been independently confirmed by more than one 19th century observer working from different sources. Matilda Coxe Stevenson arrived at Zuni in the same 1879 expedition that brought Cushing, part of a Bureau of Ethnology survey party led by her husband, James Stevenson. She continued her fieldwork at Zuni for more than 2 decades, publishing initial findings as early as 1887 in a Bureau report on Zuni religious practice among children, and completing her fullest study, the Zuni Indians, in 1904, after James Stevenson's death had left her to continue the research independently. Her records describe the same twin pillars, the same flood narrative, and the same identification of the columns as the transformed children, drawn from informants who were not necessarily the same priests who had spoken to Cushing. 2 ethnologists, working across different years and through different relationships within the Pueblo, arrived at matching accounts attached to the same physical location. That convergence does not prove the flood occurred as described. It does establish that the Zuni were not assembling a story for Cushing's particular benefit. They were transmitting one that already carried an internal, geographically anchored consistency before either outsider set foot in the valley. Cushing's access to this material was not granted quickly, and it was not granted for free. He arrived at Zuni as an outsider attached to a federal survey party, and for the first year of his residence he was treated as exactly that, permitted to observe public ceremony, but excluded from the material that mattered most. What changed his standing was less a matter of persuasion than of endurance. He learned the language well enough to converse without an interpreter, adopted Zuni dress, and submitted to a lengthy period of instruction and testing before the priesthood agreed to initiate him into the Order of the Bow, an institution responsible, among other duties, for maintaining certain categories of the tribe's sacred history. Initiation carried obligations that did not end with the ceremony. Cushing was expected to participate in the priesthood's ongoing responsibilities, and the flood account, along with the larger creation narrative it belongs to, appears to have reached him gradually, over repeated tellings, rather than in a single transcribed session. The two stone columns themselves, as both he and Stevenson described them, rise several feet above the talus at the base of the mesa, narrow enough that a person can stand beside either one and see daylight around its edges, carved by weathering into a shape that neither ethnologist claimed was obviously artificial, but that both recorded as the specific object the Zuni pointed to when they told the story, not a general description of stone, but a designation of these two, and no others, among the many outcrops along that stretch of cliff. What the Bureau of Ethnology did with this material afterward is where the story becomes an institutional one rather than a purely ethnographic one. Powell had built the Bureau around a framework borrowed in large part from the anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan, one that arranged human societies along a single developmental ladder, from savagery through barbarism to civilization, with oral tradition and origin narrative treated as evidence of a stage a society was passing through, rather than as a record a society might be keeping. Under this framework, a flood account like the one Cushing recorded was processed not as a potential witness to an actual hydrological event in the Zuni River Valley, but as a data point in a much larger 19th-century academic project. The comparative study of flood myths across world cultures, a field newly energized by the decipherment of the Mesopotamian flood tablets at Nineveh in the 1870s, and shaped, in its methodology, by the anthropologist Edward Burnett Tyler, whose 1871 survey Primitive Culture had already catalogued dozens of global deluge traditions as evidence of shared stages of primitive imagination. Zuni testimony about a specific flood at a specific mesa was filed alongside Noah's flood and the Mesopotamian Utnapishtim account, treated as one more entry in a comparative table rather than as a local record that might correspond, in some verifiable way, to a local event. Cushing's own material suffered a more specific fate within this larger pattern. His creation narrative material, the fullest version of the Chimiky'ana'kowa he had gathered across years of residence, was not published as a complete work during his lifetime. He died in 1900, at the age of 42, after choking on a fishbone, and the material he had spent years assembling was compiled and issued by the Bureau of American Ethnology afterward, in its 13th annual report, under the title Outlines of Zuni Creation Myths, dated 1896, but drawing on field notes taken more than a decade earlier and edited by colleagues who had not been present for the original telling. The posthumous editorial process meant Cushing was never able to defend, expand, or correct the material in response to the questions his peers raised about it. Some of those peers, including Powell himself, expressed skepticism not about whether Cushing had recorded what the Zuni told him accurately, but about whether Cushing had become, in the language used at the time, too close to his subjects to serve as a reliable observer. His initiation into the Bow priesthood, the access that had made the fuller account possible in the first place, was treated by some within the Bureau as a professional liability rather than a methodological achievement, a suspicion that followed him for the remainder of his career. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Cushing's case was not an isolated one within the Bureau's larger operation. The comparative mythology project that absorbed his Zuni material was applied across dozens of tribal traditions collected by other Bureau ethnologists during the same decades. Each origin account and flood narrative funneled into the same classificatory apparatus, catalogued for its resemblance to other traditions rather than examined for what it might independently establish about the specific landscape it described. The Bureau's annual appropriations from Congress were modest and were justified, in the language Powell used before congressional committees, primarily in terms of salvage, the urgent recording of vanishing customs before the people who held them were assimilated or died out, rather than in terms of sustained investigation into whether any particular tradition corresponded to a verifiable event. Funding followed the collection of material, not the testing of it. A field season spent gathering new accounts was easier to justify to Congress than a season spent drilling sediment cores to check one already on file, and the Bureau's budget, chronically smaller than Powell wanted, left little room for the kind of follow-up geology that a flood account like the Zuni one would have required to move from folklore into something closer to local history. The consequence of this institutional handling was not suppression in the sense of a document being sealed or destroyed. The material was published. It sat available in the Bureau's annual reports, open to anyone who sought it out in a federal library. But its classification as mythology, a designation that carried real administrative weight within Powell's evolutionary framework, meant it was never seriously investigated as a possible record of an actual flood event in the geological or hydrological history of the Zuni Valley. No follow-up survey was dispatched to determine whether the valley showed evidence of a flood severe enough to have generated the kind of communal crisis the tradition describes. No geologist examined the sediment layers along the Zuni River for an anomalous flood horizon that might be dated independently of the story attached to it. The account was treated as complete once it had been filed under its assigned category, and the category itself foreclosed the kind of follow-up investigation that might have connected the oral record to a physical one. This was not unique to the flood account, but the flood account illustrates the pattern with unusual clarity because it names a specific place, a specific pair of stone witnesses, and a specific mechanism, in a way that many of the other origin narratives the Bureau collected during this period did not. A tradition describing an unlocated ancestral home somewhere to the north offered nothing a survey team could go and check. The Zuni flood account offered exactly that: a river, a mesa, and 2 columns of stone that could, in principle, have been examined, dated, or at minimum photographed and measured as physical evidence rather than transcribed testimony. That the opportunity went unused for more than a century says less about the quality of the tradition than about what the Bureau considered worth pursuing once a subject had been classified as folklore rather than as an open historical question. That the valley is capable of producing exactly the kind of flood the tradition describes is not speculation. In 1905, a major flood on the Zuni River destroyed much of the historic village of Halona, the same site identified in Zuni tradition as the location of the original flood and the site the survivors rebuilt after retreating to Dowa Yalanne. The 1905 flood is documented in federal agency correspondence from the period, and it forced a substantial portion of the Pueblo's population to relocate to higher ground along the valley's edge, a pattern that mirrors, with unsettling precision, the pattern described in the tradition Cushing had recorded a generation earlier. The river that runs through Zuni territory is not, in ordinary years, an obviously dangerous waterway. It is a modest, often nearly dry channel for much of the year, fed by a watershed that depends heavily on summer monsoon rainfall across the surrounding highlands. But the valley's geology, a wide floodplain bounded by mesas capable of channeling and concentrating runoff during periods of intense rainfall, makes it capable of exactly the kind of sudden, catastrophic rise in water level that both the ancient tradition and the 1905 record independently describe. Later stream gauge records kept by the United States Geological Survey, once instrumentation was finally installed on the river in the 20th century, confirmed what the 1905 flood had already demonstrated by force. The Zuni River's flow can rise many times over its ordinary baseline within a matter of hours during the peak of the summer monsoon, driven by storm cells that concentrate rainfall over a small portion of the watershed rather than spreading it evenly across the valley. A flood generated this way does not announce itself days in advance the way a snowmelt flood on a larger river might. It arrives quickly, and in a valley without the kind of modern flood control infrastructure built along larger southwestern rivers in the 20th century, it arrives with little warning. None of this constitutes proof that the specific flood described in Zuni tradition happened exactly as the priests told Cushing it happened. It does establish, beyond argument, that the valley the tradition is set in has never stopped being capable of the event the tradition describes. The witness at the center of this account is not, in the end, Cushing or Stevenson, though both were careful and serious recorders of what they were told. The witness is the tradition itself, transmitted through the Zuni priesthood across generations before either ethnologist set foot in the valley, and maintained since without dependence on either man's published record. The Zuni did not require the Bureau of Ethnology to preserve the memory of the flood. It survived, and continues to survive, within the Pueblo's own religious structure, carried by the same institutions, the priesthoods and the Katsina societies, that carried it before 1879. What Cushing and Stevenson did was translate a small portion of that structure into a form the federal government could archive, a process that captured the content of the tradition while stripping away much of the context that gave it standing, within the Pueblo itself, as accountable knowledge rather than casual storytelling. That transmission has not depended on any archive to continue. The Zuni still hold Shalako, an annual ceremony that renews the Pueblo's relationship to its origin narrative and to the Katsina figures associated with it, a ceremony that predates Cushing's arrival and has continued, largely unbroken, in the century and a half since. The flood account occupies its place within that larger ceremonial structure, reinforced through practice rather than through publication, which is part of why its survival has never depended on whether the Bureau's published version remained in print. Stevenson, for her part, continued documenting Zuni religious life for years after her husband James died in 1888, becoming one of the first women in the country's history to hold a formal, salaried position as a government scientist, a status she used to keep returning to Zuni for field seasons that stretched across more than 2 decades. She later helped found the Women's Anthropological Society of Washington, at a time when women were routinely excluded from the professional societies where male ethnologists presented and debated their findings, and her insistence on returning to the same material Cushing had already recorded, rather than assuming his account settled the matter, is part of why the flood narrative and the pillars it explains were independently confirmed rather than resting on a single observer's report. She worked with informants Cushing had never spoken with, women in particular, whose knowledge of certain ceremonial matters diverged from what the male priesthood had shared with him, and her published record of the flood account survives as a genuinely separate line of transmission, rather than a restatement of his. Cushing's own field notes, portions of which survive today in the National Anthropological Archives in Washington, show a man increasingly uneasy about the gap between what he had been told and what his institution was prepared to do with it. In private correspondence with colleagues, he expressed frustration that the Bureau's publication format flattened distinctions the Zuni themselves maintained with care, distinctions between an account transmitted through the Bo priesthood, which he understood as carrying a status closer to sworn testimony, and stories told more casually to children or to visiting outsiders, which functioned differently within Zuni society and carried different obligations of accuracy. The published version of Outlines of Zuni Creation Myths does not fully preserve this internal hierarchy. It presents the flood narrative in roughly the same register as material Cushing himself considered less rigorously sourced, a flattening driven by the demands of a standardized government publication rather than by any Zuni understanding of their own tradition's reliability. What survived this flattening was the account itself, not its institutional standing. The Zuni continued to identify the twin pillars at the base of Dowa Yalanne as the transformed children well into the 20th century, and the identification is maintained by the Pueblo today. The mesa remains within Zuni tribal land, and access to it, along with much of the surrounding area considered sacred, is restricted by the Pueblo's own governance, a fact that has limited the kind of independent geological or archaeological investigation that might otherwise have been carried out on the pillars themselves or on the sediment layers of the valley below them. This restriction is not secrecy in the sense of concealment. It is the same distinction between respect and access that runs through indigenous relationships to sacred landscape more broadly, a distinction that 19th-century ethnology, built around the twin goals of extraction and publication, was never well equipped to accommodate, and that federal science in the 20th century largely inherited without revisiting. The geological question, whether the Zuni Valley experienced a flood event severe enough and early enough to correspond to the tradition's account, remains formally unresolved. The 1905 flood demonstrates that events of the necessary severity are possible within the valley's hydrology, but it does not, on its own, establish the age or historicity of the specific flood the tradition describes. No sediment coring study of the Zuni River floodplain, of the kind that has been used elsewhere in the American Southwest to date prehistoric flood horizons along other river systems, has ever been conducted specifically to test this tradition against the physical record. The absence of that study is worth naming plainly. It is not that the question was investigated and answered negatively. It is that the question was never formally asked, because the category the material was filed under in 1896 closed off the kind of institutional curiosity that might, under different circumstances, have asked it. Elsewhere in the Southwest, similar questions have occasionally received the kind of attention the Zuni account never got. Archaeologists working along other river systems in Arizona and New Mexico have, in isolated cases, cored floodplain sediments specifically to search for the signature of catastrophic prehistoric floods, layers of coarse gravel or displaced ash deposited by a single high-energy event rather than by ordinary seasonal deposition. Those studies exist because someone with institutional standing decided the question was worth the cost of asking it. No comparable decision was ever made for the valley below Dowa Yalanne, not because the account there was any less specific or any less anchored to a checkable location, but because by the time anyone might have proposed the work, the tradition had already been sitting for decades inside a government report, filed under a heading that told readers, before they ever opened it, what kind of material they were about to find. What remains, in the absence of that investigation, is what has always remained. Dowa Yalanne still rises above the valley floor, its summit still marked by the low stone foundations left from the 12 years the Zuni spent there during the Pueblo Revolt, a documented historical episode that the older flood account appears to have prefigured, whether by coincidence, by a pattern of cultural memory shaping the response to later crisis, or by some relationship between the two that the surviving record cannot settle on its own. The pillars still stand at the base of the mesa, weathered by more than a century of additional exposure since Cushing and Stevenson first described them in their notebooks, still identified by the Pueblo as the son and daughter given to the water so that the water would stop. Visitors who travel to the town of Zuni today can see Dowa Yalanne from the valley floor, a dark, table-topped mass of rock rising abruptly from the plain, and can see, at certain angles and in certain light, the two narrow columns standing apart from the base of the escarpment, exactly where two ethnologists working a century apart both said they would be. The Zuni River still runs through the valley below, undramatic for most of the year, capable, as it demonstrated in 1905, of rising with a speed that outstrips the geological patience its ordinary channel suggests. No federal survey has returned to test what the sediment beneath that channel might show about the flood the tradition places at the founding of Halona, Wa. No formal investigation has reconciled the specificity of the account, its named landmarks, its identified stone witnesses, its documented later echo in the Pueblo Revolt refuge, with the geological question of when, or whether, in a form outside science could verify independently of the tradition itself, the water actually came. The record Cushing carried east in the 1880s was filed, published, and set aside under a category built to hold it at arm's length from historical inquiry. The mesa it describes has not been set aside. Dowa Yalanne still catches the last light of the afternoon before anything else in the valley, its sandstone face turning a shade of red that has nothing to do with the story and everything to do with the mineral content of the rock. And still, at its base, are the two columns that generations of Zuni have pointed to as a son and a daughter who did not run from the water when the priests came for them. Cushing photographed them once, in the 1880s, with the heavy equipment of his era, and the photograph survives in the Bureau's archive, alongside notes that call the flood a myth, without ever explaining why a myth would leave two stones standing in exactly the place its narrators say they should be. The valley has had more than a century to answer that question since. It has not yet done so. The stones are still waiting, and so, in its own way, is the river. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.